I was overcome by guilt and fear, so I confessed my infidelity to my husband. He reacted harshly, evicted me from the house, called my parents. I lost everything. Ill-use pseudonyms. Let's refer to my husband as Mike and me as Laura. We're both in our late 30s and have been married for nearly 5 years. We met unexpectedly at a coffee shop, started chatting, exchanged phone numbers, and the rest, as they say, is history. For me, it felt like an instant connection. We dated for 10 months before moving in together, and after living together for about 2 years, we decided to get married. My parents insisted on a big wedding, and they covered most of the expenses, except for the alcohol and our honeymoon, which Mike's parents graciously paid for. My parents adore Mike, and his parents have always shown me a lot of love as well. Our marriage has been wonderful, and I wouldn't change a thing. Mike treats me with so much care and respect, and I try to do the same for him. It's just how we naturally express our love. But here's the problem: I cheated on Mike with a coworker a few months ago, and the guilt is eating me alive. Every time Mike does something kind for me, I feel unworthy and miserable. I've been trying to make up for what I did by being even more attentive and loving towards him since we returned from our recent vacation. While we've always been affectionate, I've been going above and beyond lately. My dad even jokes that we should get a room because we're always hugging or holding hands. I was selected to join a special project team at work. This project was crucial for the company and its stakeholders. The work was gratifying but also extremely demanding and stressful. In fact, one of my colleagues, a woman, ended up having a breakdown because of it. Most of our work was done remotely, but we had 2 in-person meetings. As we were nearing the project's completion, something went wrong with the part I was responsible for, which meant I had to spend a week at one of our company's branch offices to fix it. Originally, 4 of us were supposed to go, but at the last minute, the woman who had the breakdown couldn't make it, so it ended up being just me and another colleague, who I'll call Eric. We were on a tight deadline, so we worked from 6 a.m. until well past midnight for the first few days, spending almost all our time together. We worked at the office, and we ordered food for every meal. I was so stressed that I felt like I might break down too. But by 3 p.m. on Tuesday, we finally fixed the problem. To celebrate, Eric and I went out to a nice restaurant and had too much to drink. When we got back to the hotel, one thing led to another, and I ended up cheating on my husband. It was a spur of the moment, thoughtless decision. At first, I didn't feel guilty because I convinced myself that it was a one-time mistake due to the stress and exhaustion. The next day, we repeated what had happened the night before. But after that second time, reality hit both Eric and me hard. We regretted it immediately. Eric knew I was married, and I knew he was engaged. We decided to pretend it never happened and to avoid each other as much as possible, which wasn't too hard since we lived in different cities, and the project was nearly finished. We went our separate ways that night. On the flight home, I felt fine at first, but as I got closer to seeing Mike, my anxiety started building. When I finally saw him waiting for me at the airport, all my emotions overwhelmed me, and I started crying. We hugged and kissed each other repeatedly, holding on tight. We embraced for so long that an airport security guard had to ask us to move out of the pickup lane. Mike asked why I was crying, and I told him it was because I'd missed him so much and had been under a lot of stress. He understood, and that night we shared a very intimate and emotional evening. The first time Mike and I made love was magical. It was a few months into our relationship, during a weekend getaway to the mountains. We had rented a cozy cabin, far away from the chaos of our daily lives. The cabin was nestled in a grove of pine trees, with a breathtaking view of the valley below. I remember feeling nervous, excited, and deeply in love. We spent the day hiking and exploring the woods, laughing and talking about everything and nothing. By the time we returned to the cabin, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. We made dinner together, a simple meal of pasta and wine, but it felt like a feast. We ate by the fireplace, the flames casting a warm glow around the room. There was something electric in the air that night, a tension that built with every glance, every brush of our hands. After dinner, we moved to the couch, curling up together under a blanket. Mike kissed me gently at first, his lips soft and warm against mine. But soon, the kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more intense. We couldn't keep our hands off each other. The love and desire between us were palpable, almost overwhelming. We moved to the bedroom, our clothes discarded along the way, our hearts pounding in unison. The bed was soft, the sheets cool against our skin. Mike was so tender, so attentive to my every need. He made me feel cherished, like I was the most important person in the world. We took our time, exploring each other's bodies, savoring every touch, every kiss. When we finally came together, it was like nothing I had ever experienced before. It was more than just physical. It was a deep emotional connection that transcended words. Afterward, we lay there in each other's arms, our breathing slowly returning to normal. Mike held me close, his fingers gently stroking my hair. I remember feeling so content, so safe in his embrace. It was in that moment that I knew, without a doubt, that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with him. That night was the beginning of a new chapter in our relationship, one filled with love, passion, and mutual respect. Over the years, our lovemaking became a way for us to reconnect, to remind each other of the bond we shared. It wasn't always perfect, of course. There were times when life got in the way, when stress or exhaustion dulled the spark between us. But no matter what, we always found our way back to each other. Mike had a way of making me feel beautiful, desired, even when I was at my most vulnerable. He knew how to touch me, how to hold me, how to make me feel loved. One of the most memorable times was on our second anniversary. We had planned a romantic dinner at home, just the two of us. Mike cooked a delicious meal, and we ate by candlelight, reminiscing about our journey together. After dinner, he surprised me with a gift, a delicate silver necklace with a small heart-shaped pendant. Inside the pendant was a tiny engraving of our wedding date. I was so touched by the gesture, by the thought and care he had put into it. That night, as we lay in bed, Mike traced the outline of the necklace with his fingers, his touch sending shivers down my spine. He kissed me softly, whispering how much he loved me, how grateful he was to have me in his life. We made love slowly, tenderly, savoring every moment. It was as if time stood still, as if the outside world didn't exist. In those moments, I felt an overwhelming sense of love and connection, a bond that I thought nothing could ever break. But as time went on, things began to change. It was subtle at first, little things that I barely noticed. We both became more preoccupied with work, with the demands of our careers. Our intimate moments became less frequent, and when they did happen, they often felt rushed, more about fulfilling a need than truly connecting with each other. I missed the way we used to be, the way Mike used to look at me, like I was the only woman in the world. It wasn't that we stopped loving each other, we didn't. But somewhere along the way, the spark that had once burned so brightly began to fade. We became more like roommates than lovers, going through the motions of our daily lives without really seeing each other. I didn't realize how much I missed the intimacy, the closeness, until it was almost gone. Then came the night of the company Christmas party, about a year before the affair. Mike and I had always loved going to those parties, dressing up and dancing the night away. But that year, things were different. We had been arguing more, mostly about work and the long hours we were both putting in. I had been feeling lonely, disconnected from Mike, and the tension between us was palpable. At the party, I drank more than I usually would, trying to drown out the feelings of sadness and frustration. Mike seemed distant, preoccupied, and we barely spoke to each other. I ended up dancing with one of my colleagues, trying to have a good time despite the gnawing emptiness inside. When Mike finally pulled me aside, I was half expecting him to start another argument. But instead, he took my hand and led me outside to the terrace. The terrace was quiet, the noise from the party muffled by the thick glass doors. The night air was cool, a welcome contrast to the warmth inside. Mike turned to me, his expression soft but serious. For a moment, we just stood there, looking at each other, the weight of the past months hanging between us. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I haven't been there for you the way I should have." His words took me by surprise. I had been so wrapped up in my own feelings of neglect and loneliness that I hadn't stopped to consider that Mike might be feeling the same way. I felt a lump form in my throat as I looked at him, the man I had fallen in love with, who had always been my rock. "I'm sorry too," I managed to say, my voice shaking. "I miss us, Mike. I miss what we used to have." He took a step closer, his hand gently cupping my cheek. "We can get it back, Laura. We can find our way back to each other." I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. I wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that we could fix what had been broken. And in that moment, I felt a flicker of hope, a small flame reigniting in the darkness. Mike leaned in and kissed me, softly at first, but with a growing intensity that took my breath away. It was as if all the tension, all the frustration, melted away in that kiss. I wrapped my arms around him, pulling him closer, needing to feel him, to remind myself of the love that still existed between us. We left the party shortly after, unable to keep our hands off each other as we hurried home. When we finally made it through the door, we barely made it to the bedroom. Mike kissed me with a hunger I hadn't felt from him in months, his hands roaming over my body as if he were trying to memorize every inch of me. I responded with equal fervor, my need for him eclipsing everything else. That night was a turning point for us. We made love with a passion that had been missing for so long, a desperation to reconnect, to reclaim what we had lost. It was intense, almost primal, as if we were trying to erase the distance that had grown between us. We moved together in perfect sync, every touch, every kiss reigniting the fire that had once burned so brightly between us. Afterward, we lay entwined in each other's arms, our bodies spent, but our hearts full. Mike held me close, his fingers tracing patterns on my back. "I love you," he whispered into my hair. "I don't ever want to lose you." "I love you too," I whispered back, my voice thick with emotion. "I don't want to lose us either." We fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, feeling more connected than we had in a long time. And for a while, things got better. We made more time for each other, prioritizing our relationship over the demands of our jobs. We had more moments like that night, where the intimacy and closeness we had once taken for granted slowly began to return. But as the months went by, the old patterns started to creep back in. The long hours at work, the stress, the arguments, it all began to take its toll once more. And though we tried to fight it, the distance between us grew again. It wasn't anyone's fault, really. Life just seemed to get in the way, and before we knew it, we were back to being two people sharing a house, but not much else. I would often think back to those nights when Mike and I made love, how effortless it all felt, how connected we were. I missed the way he used to look at me, the way he would touch me as if I were the most precious thing in the world. I missed the way we used to laugh together, the way we could spend hours talking about nothing and everything. I longed for those moments, and the more I longed, the more I realized how far we had drifted apart. The worst part was that Mike seemed to notice too. There were times when I would catch him looking at me with a sadness in his eyes, as if he knew something was missing, but didn't know how to fix it. I wanted to reach out to him, to tell him that I felt it too, but the words never came. Instead, we both retreated into our own worlds, pretending that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. It was during this time that I met Eric. He was charming, attentive, and he made me feel desired in a way that I hadn't felt in a long time. It started off innocently enough, just two colleagues working closely together on a project. But as the days turned into weeks, the lines between professional and personal began to blur. Eric was everything that Mike used to be, and I found myself drawn to him in a way that I knew was dangerous. I tried to resist, to remind myself of the love that Mike and I shared, of the memories we had built together. But the more time I spent with Eric, the more I felt the pull. He made me feel alive again, made me feel like I was still desirable, still wanted. And before I knew it, I had crossed a line that I never should have crossed. The night it happened, I was overwhelmed with guilt and regret, but there was also a part of me that reveled in the attention, in the passion that I had missed so much. Eric was a temporary escape from the reality of my marriage, a way to fill the void that had grown between Mike and me. But no matter how much I tried to justify it, deep down, I knew it was wrong. After that, things spiraled out of control. The guilt consumed me, but so did the memories of those stolen moments with Eric. I found myself caught in a vicious cycle of regret and longing, torn between the life I had with Mike and the fantasy of what could have been with Eric. Every time Mike touched me, I felt like a fraud, like I didn't deserve his love. But at the same time, I couldn't stop thinking about Eric, about the way he made me feel. It wasn't long before the guilt became too much to bear. I started pulling away from Mike, afraid that he would see through me, that he would know what I had done. Our intimate moments became few and far between, and when they did happen, they were tinged with a sadness that neither of us could ignore. Mike would try to reach out, to reconnect with me, but I would push him away, too consumed by my own shame. I knew that I was destroying the very thing I had fought so hard to preserve, but I didn't know how to stop. I was caught in a web of my own making, tangled up in the lies and the deceit. I missed Mike, missed the way things used to be, but I couldn't bring myself to admit what I had done. And so I continued to pretend, to go through the motions of our marriage, all the while knowing that it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. In the quiet moments, when I was alone with my thoughts, I would often think back to those nights when Mike and I made love, when everything was perfect, and the world outside our bedroom didn't exist. I would remember the way his hands felt on my skin, the way he would whisper my name in the darkness, the way he made me feel cherished and loved. And in those moments, I would be filled with an overwhelming sense of loss, of longing for something that was gone forever. I regretted what I had done, regretted the choices I had made, but there was also a part of me that couldn't let go of the memories, of the way Eric had made me feel. It was a bittersweet kind of regret, tinged with the knowledge that I had lost something precious, but also with the understanding that I had found something in those moments with Eric that I had been missing for so long. As I sit here now, writing this, I can't help but wonder what might have been if things had been different, if Mike and I had found a way to hold on to what we had, instead of letting it slip through our fingers. I miss him, more than I can put into words. I miss the way we used to be, the way we used to love each other so completely, so fiercely. But I also know that there's no going back, that the choices I made have changed everything. And while I regret the pain I caused, both to Mike and to myself, I can't deny that those memories, those moments of love and passion, will always hold a special place in my heart. And then something truly unexpected happened, something I never could have foreseen, a terrifying and shocking incident that still haunts me. About 2 weeks after the affair, while I was still grappling with the overwhelming guilt and trying to pretend everything was normal, I started noticing strange things around our house. At first, they were small, easily dismissible, a picture frame slightly askew, a window left open that I was sure I had closed, and lights flickering when there was no reason for it. I chalked it up to my nerves being frayed from the stress I was under, both from work and from my personal life. One night, while Mike was away on a business trip, I was alone in the house. I tried to distract myself with TV, but I couldn't focus on anything. The anxiety I had been feeling for weeks was becoming unbearable. I decided to take a hot bath to relax. As I lay there in the tub, the water soothing my tense muscles, I let my mind wander. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was startled awake by a loud bang. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to listen. It sounded like it had come from the kitchen. I quickly wrapped a towel around myself and cautiously made my way downstairs. The house was eerily silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I hesitated at the doorway to the kitchen, my breath catching in my throat. The door to the backyard was wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. I knew I had locked that door. I was meticulous about it, especially when I was alone. I rushed to close it, my hands trembling. I quickly checked all the other doors and windows, making sure they were secure. But as I turned to head back upstairs, I heard it again, a loud, sharp noise, this time from the living room. It sounded like glass shattering. Panic set in. I didn't know if someone had broken into the house or if I was just imagining things. I grabbed my phone and dialed Mike's number, but there was no answer. I called him again, but still, nothing. I considered calling the police, but I didn't want to overreact if it was just my imagination running wild. Instead, I armed myself with a kitchen knife and slowly crept toward the living room. As I entered, I saw what had caused the noise. The large mirror above the fireplace had fallen and shattered into pieces on the floor. My reflection, fragmented in the shards, looked back at me with wild, terrified eyes. I was shaking so hard I could barely hold the knife. I convinced myself it was just an accident, that maybe the mirror hadn't been secured properly. But then I heard a low, guttural voice whispering my name. Laura. It was barely audible, but it sent chills down my spine. I spun around, searching the room, but there was no one there. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood frozen, my mind racing to comprehend what was happening. Was I losing my mind? Was the guilt manifesting in some twisted way? The whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. Laura. Laura. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It seemed to be all around me, echoing off the walls, seeping into my bones. I screamed, dropping the knife and covering my ears, but the voice only grew louder, more menacing. Suddenly the room went cold, unnaturally cold. My breath came out in visible puffs, and goosebumps rose on my skin. The lights flickered violently before going out completely, plunging the house into darkness. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to think. And then I felt a presence, something dark and oppressive looming over me. I turned around, and there it was, a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room. I couldn't make out any features, just a vague, dark shape that seemed to be watching me, waiting. The air was thick with malevolence, and I could feel it closing in on me, suffocating me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was rooted to the spot, my body refusing to obey. The figure began to move toward me, slow and deliberate. As it got closer, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, filling my head with incoherent words and phrases. I clutched my head, trying to block out the noise, but it was no use. The figure was almost upon me now, reaching out with what looked like long, skeletal fingers. In a desperate attempt to escape, I forced myself to move, bolting out of the room and up the stairs. I didn't stop running until I was in the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it and backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispers were still there, muffled now but persistent, scratching at the edges of my mind. I curled up on the floor, my back against the cold tiles, trying to calm myself. I kept telling myself it wasn't real, that it was all in my head, but the fear was too overwhelming. I sat there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move, until finally, exhaustion overtook me, and I passed out. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was shining, and everything seemed normal. The house was quiet, the air warm. I almost convinced myself that it had all been a nightmare, that the stress and guilt had finally pushed me to the brink. But when I went downstairs, the shattered mirror and the open back door were undeniable proof that something had happened. I cleaned up the broken glass and tried to go about my day as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house, that whatever had been there last night was still watching, waiting. The whispers were gone, but the sense of dread remained, hanging over me like a dark cloud. For the next few days I was on edge, jumping at every little noise, constantly looking over my shoulder. I barely slept, too afraid of what might happen if I closed my eyes. I didn't tell Mike about it when he got back from his trip. I didn't want him to think I was losing my mind. But deep down I was terrified that I was. The guilt, the fear, it was all becoming too much to bear. And then, one night as I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard it again. That same voice whispering my name. Laura. My heart stopped. I bolted upright, my eyes scanning the room, but it was empty. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, just like before. And then I felt it, that same cold, oppressive presence. I knew I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I packed a bag and left in the middle of the night, driving to a hotel without telling Mike. I stayed there for a few days, too scared to go back home. I tried to rationalize what had happened, telling myself it was all in my head, but the fear was too real, too visceral. Eventually, I couldn't avoid it any longer. I had to go back. When I returned, the house was quiet, nothing out of the ordinary. But the sense of dread was still there, lurking in the corners, waiting for the right moment to strike. I've been living with it ever since, pretending everything is fine, but knowing deep down that something is very, very wrong. I don't know what it is, whether it's a manifestation of my guilt, a psychological break, or something else entirely. But whatever it is, it's real, and it's terrifying. And I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending that everything is okay. After a lot of thought and 3 sessions with a fantastic therapist, I've decided that I need to tell Mike the truth. It's going to be incredibly difficult, and I know it will break his heart, but it's something I have to do. I've created a detailed timeline of the affair, which wasn't hard since it was purely physical, and lasted less than 10 hours with no emotional attachment. My therapist has also given me some helpful articles on how to support a partner dealing with infidelity, especially on what not to do. I'm mentally preparing myself for the possibility that he might need some time apart. From what I've learned, that's a normal reaction, and although it will hurt me if he reacts that way, I'll respect his need for space. Mike is a generous and caring man, so I don't think hell shut me out completely, but I'm ready for any response he might have. If you remember, I was about to confess to Mike about the brief affair I had with Eric. I planned to tell him on a Sunday morning, and I followed through. I made sure we both had the morning free because we had plans later in the day, and I wanted us to have time to talk without interruptions. That morning I was a nervous wreck and almost backed out. Looking back, I wish I had. I prepared Mike's favorite breakfast, and after we ate, I told him everything. He listened quietly, not saying a word until I was finished. Then he just stared at me like he was seeing right through me. After a moment, he excused himself and went into the home office, closing the door behind him. I went to the door and tried the handle, but it was locked. I spoke to him through the door, telling him how sorry I was and how much I loved him. I said I'd wait in the living room whenever he was ready to talk. I knew from the articles I read that I should give him space, so that's what I did. After a while, I thought I heard him talking to someone, so I quietly went back to the door to see if I could hear. I couldn't make out anything, so I returned to the living room. Then my mom called me, but I let it go to voicemail because I couldn't talk to her right then. About 20 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, I was shocked to see my parents standing there. I was about to ask them to come back later because Mike and I were in the middle of something, but my mom told me that Mike had called them and told them everything. I was stunned and speechless. My dad asked if it was true, and I asked, True about what? He then asked if I had cheated on Mike with a coworker. I admitted it and started crying. My mom asked how I could do such a thing, but before I could answer, Mike came out of the office and started talking to my parents, ignoring me completely and referring to me in the third person. He asked my dad to take me away because he wasn't in a good state of mind. I tried to get Mike to talk to me, but he just kept ignoring me, focusing only on my parents like I wasn't even there. Desperate, I hugged him, and although he didn't push me away, he didn't hug me back either. After I let go, he went back to the office and locked the door. My parents started asking me more questions, which upset me even more, so I ran to the bedroom. My mom followed me, and we talked for a while before she helped me pack a few things and we left. I told Mike through the door that I was going to stay with my parents until he was ready to talk. I didn't hear from him for the rest of the day, even though I tried calling and texting him. In my last text, I told him I was worried about him and that I was coming back to the house, but he replied and asked me to give him more space. I spent the entire day crying, wondering how things had gone so wrong. The next morning I woke up to see my parents sitting at the table with sad expressions. I thought they were just upset about the affair, but there was more to it. My dad told me that Mike had come by early that morning. I was excited and asked if they talked to him, but my dad said no, they didn't see him. Confused, I asked how they knew he had been there, and my dad explained that Mike had left my car in the driveway, filled with all my belongings. Hearing this, I felt like my world was falling apart. I ran out to the driveway and saw my car packed with trash bags full of my stuff. I collapsed on the ground, crying uncontrollably. I told my parents I needed to go talk to Mike, so I drove over to our house. Mike was home, but he wouldn't answer the door. I tried unlocking it with my keys, but the deadbolts were engaged, so I couldn't get in. I then checked my car's visor for the garage remote, but Mike had taken it. My next idea was to use the keypad to open the garage, but Mike had changed the code, locking me out of my own house. Since it was early on a Sunday, I didn't want to disturb the neighbors, so I started texting him. At first I was polite, but when he didn't respond, I got frustrated and texted that it was my house too, and he couldn't just lock me out. His reply was simply, "Sue me." I couldn't believe how cold he was being. This was the man I loved, who had always been kind and caring, and now he was treating me like a stranger. I knew I deserved some consequences, but not like this. I expected him to at least be civil, but instead he was being completely unreasonable. I returned to my parents' house, locked myself in my old room, and cried for most of the day, trying to process what had happened. The next morning, I called my boss and asked for a few days off to sort things out. I went back to our house, and this time, I managed to get in since Mike wasn't there. When I walked into our bedroom, I saw that all of Mike's clothes were gone. Then, when I entered the office, I found something that completely shattered me. Our wedding album was lying beside the shredder, with all the photos shredded to pieces. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. As I walked around the house, I noticed that all the pictures of us together were gone. After searching, I found the empty frames, confirming that Mike had destroyed all our memories. I was devastated. In desperation, I called Mike's office, but the receptionist told me he wouldn't be in all week because he had taken time off. Then I reached out to his mom. She answered the phone but told me that Mike had already told her and his dad everything. When I asked if she knew where he was, she said yes but refused to tell me and quickly hung up. This hurt me deeply because I had always had a close relationship with my in-laws. That same week, Eric started calling me repeatedly, but I sent all his calls to voicemail. When I finally listened to his messages, he was frantic, telling me to call him immediately. In his last message, he said that Mike had somehow gotten in touch with his fiancée and told her about our affair. Panicked, I called Eric and he was furious. He reminded me that we had agreed to keep the affair a secret and accused me of betraying him. I admitted that I should have warned him before confessing to Mike, but I never expected Mike to react like this. Eric told me that he had denied everything to his fiancée and that she planned to call me. He begged me to back up his story, but I refused. When he realized I wouldn't lie for him, he started insulting me, so I hung up and blocked his number. Not long after, Eric's fiancée called, and I told her the truth. She listened quietly, and when I finished, she hung up without saying a word. But the drama didn't end there. The next day at work, I was called into the HR director's office, who happened to be a friend of mine. At first, I didn't think much of it, but when I arrived, the HR manager and the head of security were also there. My heart sank. I knew I was in trouble. They asked me to sit down and started questioning me. They said someone had reported that Eric and I had an affair during work hours and that we used company resources. I broke down and confessed, but clarified that nothing happened during official work hours. The HR director then explained that since we were salaried employees on a business trip, the entire trip was considered work time, including the hotel room since it was paid for by the company. They then asked about the second night when Eric and I were together. They wanted to know if I had dinner with him that night, and I admitted I did. They asked if I had any wine, and I said yes, I had 2 glasses. Then they asked if I had paid for it, and I told them Eric had. The HR director pointed out that this violated company policy because employees are not allowed to use another employee's card for meals or drinks. As a result, I received a final written warning, while Eric was fired. To clarify, it wasn't because of gender. Eric would have faced the same consequences as me, if that was all he had done wrong. But Eric had also extended his stay by an extra day without a valid reason and charged the company for the additional day, including the flight change, the hotel, and meals, which included 2 more bottles of wine. He did all this just to spend more time with me. I felt horrible about what happened to Eric. He had been a great employee with a bright future, but now he was jobless, and his fiancée left him all because of my actions. As for me, any chance of getting a promotion is gone. And if that wasn't enough, the following Friday, I was served divorce papers at work. The receptionist called me to the front desk, saying there was a delivery. When I got there, a man handed me a box of flowers. I thought they were from Mike, and in a way they were. But after I signed for them, the man gave me the flowers and then handed me the divorce papers, saying, "Laura, you've been served." My world collapsed right there, and I couldn't stop crying. I had to leave work and take the rest of the week off. Over the next 5 months, I did everything I could to save my marriage, but Mike refused to speak to me. He hasn't said a single word to me since I confessed. Our divorce is now final, but I'm still struggling to come to terms with everything. I miss the kind and loving man Mike used to be, but I know that person is gone forever. I accept that I deserved consequences for my actions, but I never expected Mike to react so harshly. I knew there was a chance my confession could end our relationship, but I thought it was unlikely. I want to end this with a message from my husband. Mike, if you ever read this, I want you to know that I'm truly sorry, and I will always love you.